Sometimes, the only way to know whether something will work is to try it. But before a system gives something time, money, attention, or permission, it usually wants to know whether the attempt will be worth it, which creates a strange problem. The evidence that would justify the experiment may be the evidence the experiment was supposed to produce. So the unknown begins with a disadvantage, not because anyone rejected it, not because exploration is forbidden, but because the known can arrive carrying evidence, while the unknown arrives asking for permission to create some. Imagine two proposals competing for the same limited resource. One can tell you what it costs, how long it will take, what happened last time, and what outcome you can reasonably expect. The other says, "We don't know yet." Not because it is poorly designed, because discovering the answer is the reason to try it. From the perspective of exploration, that uncertainty may be the entire point. From the perspective of allocation, it is a problem. The system has to choose, and one possibility has arrived with something the other cannot yet provide, an answer. Nobody has to decide that the unknown is less valuable. The known simply becomes easier to justify. This was the part that changed the question for me. I started by asking why possibility seems to require so much justification. But justification itself wasn't the strange part. A system with limited resources needs reasons to choose one thing over another. The strange part was what happened next. The same tools that make allocation rational, evidence, comparison, prediction, expected outcomes, also happen to be the tools the unknown possesses least. And that creates a trade-off I hadn't noticed before. The system doesn't have to reject exploration. It only has to ask exploration to prove itself before it begins. Before we continue, this is Darkside Protocol, the part of Protocol Multiverse that investigates the systems behind ordinary human experience. Punchline Protocol explores what those systems feel like from inside. Debrief connects the two. You'll find the complete investigation below. Now, let's return to the system that works. Every system that works with limited resources eventually encounters the same problem. It cannot do everything. A company cannot fund every project. A laboratory cannot test every hypothesis. A city cannot build every proposal. A person cannot give equal time and attention to every possibility. So selection is not a failure of the system. It is one of the reasons a system exists. Something has to decide what receives resources now, what waits, and what receives nothing at all. And once selection becomes necessary, evaluation follows. What will this cost? How long will it take? What problem does it solve? What is the expected result? What evidence suggests it will work? These questions are not unreasonable. They protect limited resources from being distributed blindly. They make planning possible. They create accountability. They allow one option to be compared with another. But they also introduce a condition that is easy to miss. Before a possibility can compete for resources, it has to become describable in the language the system uses to choose. It needs a purpose, an expected outcome, a timeline, a reason, something that can be evaluated. Which means the first competition is not necessarily between good ideas and bad ideas. It happens earlier than that, between possibilities that can already explain themselves and possibilities that cannot yet do so. The system does not have to decide that the second category has less value. It may simply have less information available for making the decision. And when resources are limited, missing information is not neutral. It becomes part of the selection process. I think this is where I had been looking at the problem backwards. I assumed evaluation came after possibility. First, something appears, then we decide whether it deserves to continue. But systems that have to allocate scarce resources often cannot wait that long. They need enough information to decide whether the possibility gets the conditions required to develop in the first place. And suddenly, evaluation is no longer sitting at the end of exploration. It is standing near the entrance. That doesn't make evaluation wrong. Without it, allocation becomes arbitrary. But it changes the question. Because if entry requires something to already have a purpose, an expected outcome, and evidence in its favor, then uncertainty enters the process carrying a structural disadvantage. Not because uncertainty is prohibited, because it has less to show at the moment the system asks it to justify the resources required to discover what it might become. Once a system has to choose, comparison becomes useful. But comparison has a requirement of its own. The options have to share enough information to be placed beside one another. Cost can be compared with cost, time with time, risk with risk, expected return with expected return. The more clearly an option can describe itself in these terms, the easier it becomes to process. This creates something like a common language for decisions. A project becomes a budget, a timeline, a forecast, a set of measurable outcomes. A proposal becomes easier to rank because the system can see where it belongs. But not every possibility arrives in that form. Some possibilities begin without a clear outcome, because discovering the outcome is part of the process. Some cannot estimate their value because the value does not exist yet. Some cannot offer precedent because doing something without precedent is precisely what makes them exploratory. And this creates an asymmetry before the comparison even begins. One option arrives already translated into the language of the system. Another first has to become translatable. Before something can win an evaluation, it has to become evaluable. And that means the system can favor certain possibilities without ever deciding that they are better. They are simply easier to see, easier to compare, easier to defend, and easier to place inside an existing decision. This was where the distinction between value and visibility started to matter. I had assumed that if two possibilities were available, the system was comparing what each one might be worth. But that assumes both possibilities can make their value visible in the same way. They often can't. One may arrive with numbers, precedent, categories, and a familiar explanation. The other may contain something genuinely valuable and still be unable to describe that value before it has been explored. And from inside an evaluation process, those two conditions can begin to look like differences in quality, even when they are really differences in legibility. The system does not necessarily choose what matters most. It can only evaluate what has become visible enough to evaluate. And once I saw that, another question appeared. If the unknown begins with less evidence, less precedent, and less certainty, what exactly is it competing against? The known rarely arrives alone. It brings a history with it. Previous results, existing data, familiar costs, known failure rates, established procedures. People who already understand how to work with it. Sometimes even an entire vocabulary for explaining why it deserves another allocation of resources. None of this proves that the known option is better. It means the system has more information about what choosing it is likely to produce. The unknown arrives differently. It may have no history because it has not been tried. No reliable benchmark because there is nothing equivalent to compare it with. No established procedure because the procedure may have to be discovered along the way. And no evidence of success because producing that evidence is part of what exploration is supposed to do. So when the two options enter the same evaluation, they do not begin from the same informational position. One can point backward and say, here is what happened before. The other can only point forward and say, this is what we might discover. For a system responsible for limited resources, those are not equivalent claims. Evidence reduces uncertainty. Precedent makes outcomes easier to estimate. Familiarity makes costs easier to defend. The known does not need to defeat the unknown on potential. It can win simply by being easier to justify in the present. The known arrives carrying evidence. The unknown arrives asking for permission to create some. That distinction bothered me because nothing in it requires anyone to oppose exploration. Everyone involved could genuinely value new ideas. They could encourage experimentation, celebrate innovation, and still repeatedly choose the option with stronger evidence when an actual allocation has to be made. The contradiction disappears once you separate preference from selection. A system can prefer novelty in principle while selecting predictability in practice, because the two decisions are being made under different conditions. One asks, would something new be valuable? The other asks, can we justify spending limited resources on this particular uncertainty now? And the second question has access to evidence the first one doesn't need. That means the advantage of the known can reproduce itself without becoming a policy, an ideology, or even an intention. Each individual decision can remain completely reasonable. The pattern only becomes visible when those reasonable decisions accumulate. This creates a problem that becomes most visible at the edge of what a system already knows. Suppose an idea needs evidence before resources can be committed to it. That sounds reasonable. But suppose the evidence does not exist yet because producing it requires the very experiment those resources would make possible. Now the sequence begins to fold back on itself. To justify the attempt, you need evidence. To produce the evidence, you need the attempt. The more genuinely exploratory the possibility is, the harder this problem can become. If something has already been tested many times, precedent can support the next decision. If something resembles an existing model, data from that model may help predict the outcome. But the further a possibility moves beyond what has already been established, the less inherited evidence it can bring with it. This means the demand for proof can become strongest precisely where proof is least available in advance. Systems sometimes respond by creating protected spaces for exploration, research grants, experimental budgets, pilot programs, prototypes, limited trials, mechanisms designed to allow uncertainty to produce information before being judged by the standards of a finished outcome. Their existence reveals something important. Exploration often needs a temporary exemption from the normal logic of allocation because normal allocation prefers evidence that exploration has not had the opportunity to create. Sometimes the evidence required to authorize exploration is the evidence exploration was supposed to produce. This was the point where the mechanism stopped looking like a simple preference for safe decisions. The deeper problem was sequence. Evaluation wants information before commitment. Exploration creates information through commitment. Both requirements make sense on their own. Put them in the wrong order and they begin working against each other. And suddenly, the question isn't whether the system values new possibilities, it is whether those possibilities can survive long enough to become knowable. Because an unknown possibility does not necessarily fail when the answer is no. It can disappear one step earlier, when the system asks for an answer that does not exist yet. A single decision like this may not matter very much. The familiar project receives funding. The measurable proposal gets approved. The experiment with clearer outcomes gets another month, while the one that is harder to explain waits. Each decision can be reasonable on its own. But systems are not built from one decision. They are built from repeated selection. And repetition changes the environment. Options that receive resources produce results. Results produce data. Data makes the next evaluation easier. Successful procedures become precedents. Precedents become benchmarks. Benchmarks make future allocations easier to defend. So the option that was already easier to evaluate can become even easier to evaluate the next time. Exploration faces the opposite problem. If an uncertain possibility does not receive enough resources to be tested, it produces less evidence. With less evidence, it remains harder to justify. And because it remains harder to justify, it may receive fewer opportunities to produce the evidence that would change its position. No rule against uncertainty is required. No committee has to decide that exploration matters less. The system only has to repeatedly allocate toward what can explain itself more clearly at the moment of selection. Over time, that small advantage can accumulate. The known becomes better documented because it was selected, and more selectable because it became better documented. The system does not have to choose against uncertainty. It only has to repeatedly choose in favor of what can explain itself. This was where I stopped looking for a single filter. There wasn't one. There was a feedback loop. Evidence helped something receive resources. Resources helped it produce more evidence. More evidence made the next allocation easier, and once that loop exists, the system can gradually change what survives inside it without ever defining what should disappear. That distinction matters. Selection does not need prohibition. It only needs a recurring advantage. And perhaps that is why the effect is so difficult to notice from inside the system. Every individual choice can still look sensible. Every demand for evidence can still look responsible. Every allocation can still be defended. You only see the dark side when you stop examining the decisions one at a time and start looking at what kind of possibilities those decisions repeatedly allow to become real. Systems do not only select possibilities. Possibilities can also adapt to systems. If access to resources depends on being understandable, measurable, and defensible, then exploration gradually learns how to present itself in those terms. Curiosity becomes a goal, an experiment becomes a project, an interest becomes a useful skill, an idea acquires a timeline, an expected outcome, and a reason it deserves attention. None of these translations are necessarily harmful. They can turn vague possibilities into things that can actually be organized and pursued. But something changes when translation becomes a condition of entry. The possibility begins preparing its justification before it has had enough space to discover what it is. And this logic does not have to remain inside companies, laboratories, governments, or institutions. Individuals also allocate limited resources. We decide what deserves an evening, a weekend, a year, some money, a period of attention. We compare alternatives. We estimate outcomes. We ask whether something is worth the time. And the criteria that make allocation easier at a larger scale can become useful at a personal one. What is this for? Where will it lead? Is it practical? Will it pay off? Can I justify spending time on it? These are reasonable questions, but when they arrive before exploration, they reproduce the same asymmetry. Possibilities that can already explain their value receive attention more easily. Possibilities whose value might only become visible through experience have to defend themselves before that experience exists. The same allocation logic can appear at a personal scale, not as a command, but as a practical way of deciding what deserves one of your scarcest resources, your own time. I think this is where the original question finally changed shape. Maybe the strange thing isn't that we became less imaginative. Maybe imagination learned that arriving undefined makes it difficult to compete. So it began arriving prepared, with a purpose, with a destination, with an answer to the question, what will this become? And that adaptation makes sense. We cannot pursue every curiosity, test every possibility, or give unlimited time to everything that catches our attention. Some filter has to exist. But there is a trade-off hidden inside that necessity. The better we become at allocating attention toward what can justify itself in advance, the less room remains for things whose justification can only be discovered afterward. And perhaps that is the final transformation. The system no longer needs to ask possibility for an explanation. Eventually, possibility learns to bring one before it is asked. We began with a simple contradiction. Sometimes the only way to know whether something is worth trying is to try it. But systems responsible for limited resources often need reasons before the attempt begins. So they evaluate, they compare, they ask for evidence, expected outcomes, and reasons to commit. None of that is irrational. It is how limited resources become manageable. But those tools do not treat every possibility equally. The known arrives with history. The measurable arrives with numbers. The familiar arrives with precedent. The predictable arrives with an explanation of what happens next. The unknown arrives with less. And if access to resources repeatedly depends on what can be justified before exploration begins, the advantage compounds. What receives resources produces evidence. What produces evidence becomes easier to support again. Eventually, even exploration adapts. Curiosity learns to describe its purpose. Possibility learns to predict its destination. Maybe learns that "I don't know yet" is no longer enough. Nothing had to ban the unknown. Nothing had to declare imagination irresponsible. The system only had to keep asking reasonable questions. What is this for? What will it produce? How long will it take? What evidence supports it? Why does it deserve the resource? And somewhere inside that sequence, possibility stopped arriving as an open question and started arriving as something prepared for evaluation. I started this investigation looking for the thing that makes possibility justify itself. I expected to find a restriction. Instead, I found allocation, a system trying to make responsible choices with limited resources. And that is what makes the trade-off difficult to see. Evidence is useful, prediction is useful, accountability is useful. We need ways to decide what deserves our money, our attention, and our time. But the unknown has a strange relationship with proof. Sometimes its value cannot become visible until after we have given it room to exist, which means a system can become exceptionally good at selecting what can already explain itself, while becoming less hospitable to what can only explain itself later. Perhaps that is why maybe now so often arrives with a reason attached. Not because possibility disappeared, not because imagination stopped working. It adapted to the admission process. The system did not reject imagination. It taught imagination to submit an application. If this investigation changed the way you think about possibility, this is only one layer of a larger system. Punchline Protocol explores what these structures feel like from inside a human life. Darkside Protocol follows the systems that make those experiences possible. Debrief Protocol connects both perspectives and looks for the larger pattern between them. If you'd like to continue the investigation, you'll find the other chapters in the description below. The unknown cannot always prove what it will become. Sometimes, becoming is the proof. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation is yours.